I keep hearing all these terms which are thrown about, which we read about in the papers, things like demographic transition, demographic dividend, and dependency ratio. And I've read some of your work, and of course, all these things have a lot to do with mortality and fertility, as you just mentioned. So, can you just unpack for the benefit of our readers what exactly do these terms mean vis-a-vis the larger debates that we are facing today?
Yeah, sure. So the way that I like to explain it to a non-demographic audience is if you think about a household, imagine a multi-generational family where for a while, mostly everyone is either a child or kind of an older person. So the earners that are there are stretched quite thin. They're caring for their aging parents. They're also taking care of their young children. And then you fast forward a generation later. Those children have then grown into earners themselves, and they don't yet have their own large families to support. And so for those years, the household has more income than mouths to feed, right? And so what happens? The family saves more, invests in the next generation, whether in terms of health, education, etc. And then it can also accumulate wealth. And that window, that sort of phenomenon is called the demographic dividend. It's important to note that the household didn't get richer because people worked harder. It got richer because that ratio of earners to dependents improved. And for a country, it's the same thing that happens. The demographic dividend is this potential economic growth that a country can enjoy as a result of its shifting age structure because of fertility and mortality. So essentially, this age structure shifts because there's a set pattern. First, your death rates fall. That's mortality rates. Then, a generation later, the fertility starts to fall. There's fewer births. And this two-step is what demographers call the demographic transition. And in between those two falls, the country has this boom or temporary bulge in the working age population. And India is in that bulge right now. And the other term you mentioned, which was the dependency ratio, that's just the technical accounting of everything that's going on. It's the number of dependents, and which is usually defined as people under 15, people over 64, divided by the number of working age people times 100. And how do you interpret that? A higher ratio means that there's fewer working age individuals that are carrying the financial and sort of social responsibility of supporting more dependents. This can lead to increased tax burdens or a strain on public services. And a lower ratio suggests a much healthier economy where there is this large active workforce that can support a smaller dependent population. And India's dependency ratio actually peaked. So it was highest around 1971. It was about 80. And mostly the dependents there, as you can imagine, were children. And now it's 47 or around there, which is close to the bottom of the curve. And when that ratio bottoms out and then starts rising again, that's when your dividend phase is closing. To put it another way, the demographic dividend is a window, right? It's not an outcome. Sometimes people think of it as, we got this, we got the demographic dividend, our work is done, we're an economic superpower. It doesn't deliver growth, it delivers the conditions for growth. And so reaping that demographic dividend really depends on a conducive environment that prioritizes good healthcare, a quality education, decent employment opportunities, gender empowerment, and so much more. So what you do inside that window is what determines whether the dividend becomes a dividend or whether it becomes a disaster.
Right. Thank you for that really beautiful explanation of these terms, Apoorva. You said that demographic dividend is a window. It's not really some kind of a dividend in terms of an outcome. But we keep hearing about realizing this demographic dividend, and people are talking about measuring this demographic dividend. There was one recent research paper which says that a 2025 study that says India's demographic dividend was 1.9 percentage points during 1981 to 2001, but it collapsed due to COVID and the pandemic. So these are estimates happening around demographic dividend. How are they made and what do they mean?
Yeah, I think the paper that you're referring to was a really, really interesting paper. It wasn't mine, so I hope I'll do it justice. But basically, these are counterfactual exercises that help us understand what if you choose to pull this lever versus another. And the question in here is, how much faster did India grow because of its conducive age structure compared to a world in which the age structure stayed unchanged? And when you do this counterfactual exercise, there's two common approaches that you can do. There's one that's called the National Transfer Accounts, and it basically tracks how each age group earns, consumes, transfers, aggregates those flows into an arithmetic of who is contributing what at each point in the cycle. The second, which is in the paper that you mentioned, uses a panel regression. Basically, they take many countries over time, isolate the effect of age structure on growth after controlling for everything else. And the reason, I think, we won't get into the methodology that much, but why this was important is that 1.9 percentage points that you mentioned. And the reason it's important is because of the compounding effect. These sort of 2 percentage points a year over 4 decades is the difference between today's India and an India where the GDP per capita was something like 80% lower, right? That's massive. And then you mentioned COVID, so I think that's an important point, how this advantage collapsed during COVID. The favorable effect didn't vanish, as in the age structure didn't change overnight. But what happened was that the realized contribution to the growth turned negative for those 2 years because, as we all saw, the economy contracted, people couldn't work, etc. And so the framing in the paper is that the dividend withered in 2021. It's not that it ended permanently. And the bigger worry that the paper underscores is that even before COVID, the contribution had peaked. And I think another important caveat to add here is that this aggregated growth contribution of 1.9 or 2 percentage points tells you nothing about who received those gains, right? And that's where I think demography, sociology, even anthropology is so important in terms of understanding some of that distribution. India's top 1% now holds about 40% of national wealth. SC workers earn 32% less than equally qualified forward caste peers, right? 71% of SC households are landless agricultural laborers. I can go on and on. Unless there is a more equitable distribution of this dividend, we may just see an intensification of inequality.
It's interesting you mentioned the equitable distribution of this, whatever benefits we're getting from this demographic dividend. But coming to the larger picture of where India is right now, you said the dependency ratio is coming down. It's going to bottom out in a few years. So, there are like different phases of this window. There's the early phase, the middle phase, and the late phase. So, where exactly is India located right now, and how many years do we have before the window closes?
It's a great question. So India right now, we're in the middle of the window, and it's expected to last until about 2039, which is not that long. Our working age population, by the way, is going to peak between 2030 and 2040. And that's why the window, the demographic dividend window, really starts to close around 2051. And, this idea that fertility is declining that, we've been seeing, also there are other indicators that are important to look at. The median age is 28 today. We're a young country. It's going to be 39 by the middle of the century, and it'll climb towards 50 by the end of the century. And so what this means is that, you look at the share of Indians right now that are above 60, it's about 11% right now. In the middle of the century, it'll be roughly 21%. And the sheer volume of number is something to contend with. But I think, in short, to answer your question, we have roughly 25 years. That's one generation before the conditions that made all of this possible begin to go away. And I think of where we are right now as the demographic version of someone's late 20s. We're in our productive peak. We're at a moment where the body is most resilient, recovery is fastest, and gains are compounding, right? And there's no biohacking our way to get a second late 20s. And so when the working age share starts to shrink, it stays shrinking until the end of the century. And so you mentioned the paper that I wrote recently. And in that paper, I say that the risk is not that we're failing this window because the window is short. We are at risk of failing because India's policy and political bandwidth has not yet adjusted to the fact that the window is closing. And I think in many ways, the demographic window of opportunity is sometimes narrowly construed as this period of heightened economic output. But it's also a time to lay the fiscal and institutional groundwork for ensured prosperity after the window closes. Everything's not going to collapse after 2051. But for that, we have to start acting now. And so, as the dependency ratio bottoms out, which you mentioned, the questions have to start changing. They stop being about how do you get people in the labor force? How do you educate our young people? Of course, that's important. But you also need to start thinking about how to take care of people leaving the labor force and aging. And we're not yet asking that second question, that set of questions quite seriously yet.